So before we get started, it's important to remember what we're doing all this work for, about the services that people provide to trees. There's a quick review of some of the services that trees are providing to us. Cleaning the air we breathe and the water we drink are fundamental services and perhaps taken for granted. But trees also improve our health physically and mentally, along with long-term effects on our well-being. They provide shelter and food for animals that depend on trees for their survival. And it's simple, really, we need trees. This workshop is based on Portland's local tree care providers webpage. It's a list of tree care companies that serve as a resource for the public who want to hire a qualified tree care professional. The page averages about 500 page visits a month, and when a city employee is asked to recommend a company, they will often recommend a company found on this list, rather than making individual recommendations. There are a few criteria to get on the list. First, a tree care company must send a certified arborist to the workshop once a year to stay current with any tree code changes, have an active Portland business license, and have no documented tree code violations or problematic permit applications. There are probably over 200 tree care companies working in Portland, and these requirements to get on the list serve the public in finding a qualified company. Occasionally, a company is removed from the list. This may happen for one or more reasons. They might have a documented tree code violation, there are continued issues with permit applications, perhaps their Portland business license is not current, they do not have a certified arborist on staff, or the company has not sent a representative to a workshop over a year. Companies do return to the list after being removed. Title 11 is the Portland Tree Code. You can find it online. It has 11 chapters. And the ones listed on the right are some that are used most often by tree care providers. If you look up a couple of the chapters, we recommend 11.4 Tree Permit Requirements and 11.8 Definitions and Measurements. There's a great walkthrough on Portland's website. Go to Tree Permits, then look for the Do I Need a Permit topic. If you already know that you need a permit, you can visit the Apply for a Tree Permit page. You can also call and leave a message for the tree technicians at 503-823-TREE. And please note that the line is not answered live unless you are reporting an emergency situation. Please be prepared to leave a message. The current standard of service is to return your call within 3 business days. You can also send an email with your questions to trees@portlandoregon.gov. Now I'm going to pass it along to Renee Moog to present. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be covering the non-development part of this presentation, and we make a distinction between non-development and development because the procedures for requesting a permit and the criteria that's considered are very different. Next. So first of all, I want to say the first thing we look at in non-development situations is the tree located on a property within the city of Portland jurisdictions? And if it is, then we look at if it's regulated under the tree code. So there are some times when a permit's not required. And this slide outlines those times. For pruning, it's branches less than ½ inch or roots less than ¼ inch for severe street trees. And then we move down to pruning trees on private property. Sometimes we get calls about, getting a permit for private property. And generally speaking, you don't need a permit for private property trees, except in the situations that are laid out here, native trees in the CP and V overlay zones. Now, overlay zones and several other kind of in-depth detailed topics are going to be talked about a little bit later in the presentation. And you should have some handouts as well. So if you don't know what this is specifically referring to. We'll get into that a little bit later. So when there is no associated tree removal, you don't need a permit for planting trees on private property. And as far as removal goes, you don't need a permit for street tree sucker shoots or self-sown trees that are less than 1/2 inch in diameter. And then, of course, Sam mentioned our tree code. If you look at chapter 11.4 goes into specifically what sizes are regulated and when, and if the tree that you're working on is not regulated, then you don't need a permit. So there are some situations that have special considerations. I've labeled some of them down here: parking lot trees, open development permits, or land use decisions. We probably won't get into, I won't get into details on that. Next, please. Okay, so then we're going to get to where most of the questions are, and that is, when do you need a permit for urban forestry? And we look at two general groups. One is this a private tree? That's a tree on private property. And of course, we're not talking about heritage trees here. Heritage trees always need consideration for a permit. The second group is street trees, which we define as the trees between the public property and, between the private property and the road, essentially. So some people refer to them as city trees, some people refer to them as parkway trees, but I'm going to refer to them as street trees. So this chart, breaks it down, but basically for private trees, most times it's a removal replant permit that we're looking at for anything that is generally speaking greater than 12 inches in diameter at breast height, which is abbreviated here as DBH. That's defined as a diameter at 4.5 feet at the ground. And there's a table that 40.1, which you have, which is going to go into details on exceptions to that. So there is a fee for that permit application. This second category, street trees, is much more highly regulated, and basically a permit is required for almost any activity besides the previous, what I mentioned on the previous slide. With the pruning permits for street trees, sometimes you need an inspection and sometimes you don't, depending on what type of pruning. So the cost of that permit and how you would apply varies a little bit. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details on some of these concepts, but I'm just going to mention them. There's special considerations when you're looking at permit requirements for heritage trees. And then, as I mentioned previously, certain overlay zones and plan districts. The details, once again, are on table 40.1. There's a consideration if you're doing a work for a utility company, for example, they may have a permit that is an overarching permit for all of their tree needs, and that's called a programmatic permit. Then there's emergency situations, when we'll probably talk a lot about that given the recent storm, when because of an emergency situation, part or all of a tree had to be taken down without a permit, then without an existing permit, then you would need to consider a retroactive permit. This slide mentions that it needs to be filed within 7 days. Currently, because of the high demand post-storm, we have relaxed that time frame. And there's information on our website that will be updated as that the response to the storm goes on. I actually, in the chat early on, I put a link to that news release on our website, and I would take a look at it when you get a chance, specifically for retroactive permits and emergency situations. The other situation where sometimes there's special considerations, if it's a parking lot tree, that gets into issues with Title 33, which is through the Bureau of Development Services, Planning and Zoning. And I'm not going to go into a lot of specifics on that. Next slide, please. All right, so when you apply for a permit, what are we going to be looking at? These are some of the factors here. The species, the size or diameter breast height, is the address within the city of Portland, where is the tree within the site, who owns the tree. Sometimes it's a boundary tree, and that gets to be a little bit of an issue. What's the health of the tree, and is the tree native or nuisance species? If you need to know what we consider native or nuisance species, there are lists on our website, along with a lot of other technical information in the tree resource section. All right, next slide, please. So we're going to talk about street trees first. On the pruning permits, we always ask that you follow industry pruning standards, and whether you need a permit, what kind of permit is based on what kind of pruning you're doing. So here are a couple considerations, and the third bullet down, the clearance standards apply. This has to do with whether you, if you describe the type of pruning you're doing as clearance, then that's what that's the criteria that you're aiming to achieve. Okay, next slide, please. So we're still talking only about street trees here. Street trees do require a root pruning permit for roots that are 1/4 inch or greater. And if you're working with a client who is having a sidewalk repaired, for example, the key thing about root pruning permits is you have to see the roots in order to inspect them, which means the sidewalk must be lifted and the tree roots exposed before inspection. And then the tree inspector will always make a site visit. They'll mark the roots that would be allowed to be cut and leave the permit on site. Next slide, please. These photos show what I just explained, making sure that you have the roots exposed, for example, with a sidewalk repair, having the sidewalk panel up, and then we do prioritize these. So if a root pruning permit application comes in, we assign it first thing in the morning. The tree inspectors try to get to it within that day. Sometimes if they're super busy, it would be the next day. So in the interim, you should, secure the site with caution tape. And then the bottom photo with the orange is showing you what it's going to look like when the tree inspectors mark the roots that are allowed to be pruned. Next slide, please. So once again, we're talking about street trees here. If it meets the criteria listed and there's bullet points, it can be self-issued. That's something that you can do through our online system, or you can send in an application by email if it's self-issued. One of the keys is that there's no fee for this permit. That's why you can send it in by email. Anything that requires a payment, we don't generally accept by email. So the situations that you can get a self-issued permit are spelled out here. Keep in mind that if it doesn't meet these criteria, you need a street tree pruning permit that requires an inspection and a fee. Next slide, please. So once again, emergency pruning does have to happen sometimes when there is clear and present danger and there's not sufficient time to go through this whole process of getting a permit. That is considered an emergency pruning, and you would be required to submit a retroactive, that means after the fact, permit application. And once again, the 7 days mentioned here, because of the storm response, is temporarily extended. I believe the date is February 23rd right now. You can check our website for any potential updates in the future. Keep in mind, with any retroactive permits, we're going to want to see photos that substantiate the fact that there was clear and present danger or an emergency. All right, next slide. So still talking about street trees, it is required to have a permit first to plant a street tree. And the part of that is because the tree inspector is going to mark the potential planting spots and verify that the tree species being proposed is currently on our approved street tree planting list. Those lists are based on the planting site. So how much room do you have? Are there wires overhead, etc.? And so if you're going to be applying for a street tree planting permit with your clients, make sure that the proposed tree corresponds to the approved street tree planting list, which you can see detailed on the spreadsheet you have. I believe it lists all the different street trees approved in different situations, and then we also have that information on our website. As always, I don't think I really have to spell it out, but here it is, that proper planting techniques are required. All right, next slide, please. That's what the approved street tree planting lists look like. They are brochures. We don't distribute them proactively, but if you want some, or you want to provide one to your client or something, we can send them to you. You can pick them up at our Development Services Center office, or they are all linked. They are all PDFs on our website. Next slide, please. All right, so for street trees still, we're just talking about street trees right now. You do need a replant permit to remove a tree. And they're broken into two different types. The first, type A, is maybe what you might consider more straightforward. Is the tree dead, dying, or dangerous? Or is it under 3 inches in diameter? If it meets those criterias, then there's not a lot of other considerations as far as whether a permit will be issued or not. Next slide, please. So the second type of permit, type B permit, this is for street tree removal, is when you have a healthy tree and yet for some reason it's being requested to be removed. This is a case-by-case situation, and for street trees especially, it would really take an extraordinary circumstance to approve that kind of permit. The factors that are considered by the tree inspector are spelled out there. And so, when you're applying, any information that you can provide on as far as notes, is gonna help the tree inspector understand the situation. If you have any kind of documentation, you can submit that with the tree permit application so that they can have that as a consideration. Next slide, please. All right, so I've already talked quite a bit about the retroactive permits. This is specifically for removal and replant permit. This slide is standard criteria. Where it says here, applicant must provide documentation, photos, exclamation point to prove the emergency existed. Given the nature of the recent storm and how fast and furious it came on and how many trees were affected, we are allowing for other kind of documentation in addition to photos to substantiate that there was a danger, clear and present danger, before the tree was removed. And then the timing, once again, has been extended to February 23rd. So I'm just gonna read you what's on that news posting that went up yesterday, that in addition to potentially providing photographs, the application can also come in with an arborist written statement about why there was an emergency. An insurance claim indicating tree-related damages could be provided as substantiation. And of course, if you can leave any part of the physical debris stump on site, that's going to help the tree inspector understand the situation of the tree before it was removed and help them determine whether they can approve a retroactive permit. Next slide, please. So for street trees, they are, like I said, heavily regulated. There are other activities that require a permit. They are less common than the planting or pruning or removal permits. And some of those permits might be ornamental lighting, attaching signs, artwork, cabling. So keep that in mind, that if a permit is required to basically to attach any permanent objects to a city or street tree or its support. This also includes chemical applications as far as needing a permit. Next slide, please. All right, that was all about street trees. Now I'm moving on to private trees, which, and I'm not referring to heritage trees because we all know heritage trees have special considerations. So I've already gone over a little bit about the fact that root pruning is not required for private trees. And for the most part, pruning permits are not required for private trees either, but there are exceptions. Keep in mind, pruning is what we would ask to first be considered on maintenance of a tree. If one of your clients was interested in removing a tree, perhaps that doesn't have to happen if there's pruning possible that will stabilize and maintain the tree in a for its the longest life it could possibly have that way. So just want to point out here that sometimes you can't address things by pruning, but you should keep in mind that cutting and removing the crown, the trunk, or the root system that results in a loss of physiological viability, or girdling, poisoning, topping, or drowning a tree are not permitted. They are not considered pruning, and they would be looked at as removal of a tree, even if the complete tree is not down, and they would require a permit. Next slide, please. So this is just illustrating a couple of reasons why pruning may not be the final answer. As you guys have a lot more experience than us guys here. So next slide, please. All right, so we're still talking about private trees. We're moving on from pruning to removing. So when do you need a permit? When the tree is regulated, essentially. So there are exceptions to the 12-inch standard minimum thresholds. In some places it's 6 inches, depending on overlay and plan districts. But all that's spelled out in your resources and the tree code. Next slide, please. So for private tree removal, there's also 2 different categories, type A permits. The first and foremost, we're looking at is the tree within 10 feet of a building or attached structure. And this isn't any building, this is a permitted building for the most part. Attached structure has some specific guidelines that I'm not going to get into, but in generally speaking, you know, if, for example, if you have a deck and it's attached to the house, you're measuring from the edge of the deck, not the edge of the house. As far as size goes, if it is less than 20 inches and is a regulated tree, then and the less than 20 inches here, it says 19.9. So, you know, if it's really close, we might have to do a site visit, but let's say less than 20 allows you to get a type A permit, which means it's much quicker, doesn't need an inspection necessarily. Also, if the tree is dead, dying, or dangerous, or as a nuisance species, it is considered a type A permit. Those at this time, though, those criteria are also require a site inspection. So I want to point out something that sometimes is misunderstood, that you can have a type A permit that is issued what's called over the counter, meaning without an inspection, or it may need an inspection, even if it's type A. Next slide, please. All right, so type B permits are the ones that are a little more complex. And I see there's a hand raised. Tiana, are you taking hand raised questions?
Sure, I've unmuted Alfred.
All right, so my question is, I know it's a, if it's a dead private tree, it would require an inspection during the active growing season, but my understanding was if it was deciduous and it was in the active growing season, no leaves present, and it's clearly presentable the tree is dead, a site visit was not required. Has that changed?
That has never been the case as far as I know.
Okay, so a
the
site
tree
visit is
techs
required.
like myself that are sitting behind a desk are not authorized to determine if a tree is dead or
Okay.
dying or dangerous. Even if you, as qualified and very competent and knowledgeable arborists, tell us that, we sitting behind a desk are not authorized. So it does require an inspection. There is discussion about ways to potentially shift that procedure, but right now, any tree that is, the reason it's being taken out is because it's dead. If it doesn't meet the other criteria, then it cannot be issued over the counter. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna go back to the type B permits. So I just want to state up front that any type B permit is gonna involve a tree inspector. I'm not a tree inspector, I'm not an arborist. And so, you know, very specific questions about type B permits, I'm not going to address. Basically, type B is when you have a healthy tree that is 20 inches or greater diameter breast height, or more than 4 trees that are greater than 12 inches that don't meet one of the other review factors. And I've put some small print in here that we can get into if you have a question about, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But if we cannot issue them as a type A permit, it goes to type B. And then there's going to be much more involved in making a decision and much more information that is potentially looked at. So I would encourage you, if you have an unusual situation, to add some details to the permit application. And if there's any kind of history of disease or failure, that there's photos that show that or reports, because a tree inspector can't make a decision on information they don't have. All right, next slide, please. So the tree inspector, when they look at type B permits, are going to first ask if there's any practical alternatives to removal, because keep in mind, you know, one of the underlying ideas of maintaining our urban forestry is to try to maintain it rather than start it again by replacing a mature tree with a smaller tree. So they're going to look at some of the criteria that's listed out here. They may look at other criteria. It really is a case-by-case situation. Next slide, please. So a lot of individual property owners who you deal with are going to ask to have a tree removed because they want to plant a garden and they need sun, or they don't like the mess, or it's in the way of something else. And those are not valid considerations for type B. So if it doesn't meet the type A criteria and it's a healthy tree and we've moved on to type B, please advise your clients appropriately whether they can expect a permit or not. All right, next slide. So we've talked a lot about the retroactive emergency removal, and I think I've covered this slide already. So I'm going to just go on to the next slide. All right, so the overlay zones has come up as a term already several times. What are they? They are specific areas that the city has labeled with different letters, like C, P, V. They all signal different special considerations. Typically, these areas are near water or natural areas. They could also have something to do with a scenic corridor. They're all laid out in table 41. And of course, there's information on our website. So when you have an overlay zone, the criteria that are looked at are more restrictive generally and may involve Title 33, which is administered by the Bureau of Development Services. And they also may involve requiring native trees to be planted versus any tree. All right, next slide, please. So, like a lot of these topics, I'm referring you to our other resources online. There's a lot of details that will help you get into the nitty-gritty of some of these concepts. But I will also say, if you're not finding the information you want on this topic or any topic, you can reach out to the Tree Tech team, and we will either research the question ourselves or get you over to somebody that can help. Next slide. All right, so one of my favorite tools that I go to for specific information about overlay zones is portlandmaps.com. You enter the property address and then scroll down to the information about zoning. It will bring up, it will give you the specific zoning. And then it will if you click on it, it will give you the topographical map that shows where the zones are within the property. You should research that on any property that's in an environmental zone before you apply. Because, for example, if you're taking out if you want to remove a tree on the private property that's not in the environmental zone and you are going to replant in an environmental zone, it needs to be a native species. And if you don't give us a native species, it's going to delay your application. All right, next slide, please. So you have probably noticed that we call this type of permit a removal replant permit. That's because there is a component of the permit that has to do with tree planting compliance. So it's basically making sure that every time you take a tree out, that we're addressing our future urban canopy by mitigating that with replanting a tree unless there's some exception. Next slide. So when you're replanting trees, of course, we want those trees to survive, and you probably all know this much better than this slide can spell out, but if you have a quality tree, you're going to have a more success. So a lot of people are concerned that they can't find the trees at the caliper that they're looking for in our nurseries. And I just want to point out that there are not only a lot of nurseries in Portland, but there's nurseries in the larger area. They are listed on our website. If you go to the tree resource area, it will give you a link to additional resources for trees. This is I think a self-explanatory graphic showing you that there's considerations from the roots up to the tip of choosing a good tree, and I would encourage you to get the best quality tree you can going forward, so your client has contributed back into the urban forest. Okay, next slide. So mitigation is a general term for replacing the tree or replacing the value of the tree. Generally speaking, with the removal, this is for non-development situations, the planting new trees for trees removed, excuse me, or occasionally there is a consideration with fee in lieu. It is a rare situation though, and very detailed, and I probably won't go into a lot of detail on that today, given the time constraints. But the idea is that we want to keep our urban forest growing. Next slide, please. Okay, so back to the idea of A permits. A type permits, the replacement is tree for tree. You remove a tree, you replant a tree. Next slide. Occasionally, people have a legitimate reason for not wanting to replant a tree. and they can request a replanting waiver, which requires a density inspection. There is $100 fee for the density inspection. There is a separate form for this that needs to be filled out with all detailing the trees that would be remaining on the private property after the tree that's being proposed to removed is gone. This information is going to be looked at by the tree inspector, and they're going to look at density standards and other considerations. This really is something that we would ask you to only turn to if there's no other option. And if you are going to submit this has to be submitted with the removal replant permit application at the same time. It is a very point of time assessment. And so previously granted density waivers will not be considered either. Okay, next slide, please. So when we talk about density, this is what how we figure density as far as the quantitatively. I don't work a lot with density, so I'm not really going to go into a lot of specifics here. This is just to give you an idea what is considered when it comes to density. Next slide. So this is the encouragement to work with your clients who are saying they don't want to replant, to explain all the reasons why it's good to replant, and to help them potentially seize planting opportunities that they're not identifying, and to to only make the waiver applications a rare circumstance. Next slide. So moving on to bee permits, this gets a little more complicated. There's a lot of specifics around mitigation for bee permits, and just the basic is that it can either be tree for tree, like I've mentioned, or for other criteria, it can be inch for inch. And when it's inch for inch, the criteria is looking at planting up to density standards. There's also this little asterisk down below that in certain situations, there's a public notice that is could potentially be part of the timeline and the considerations for bee permits. Next slide. All right, so just to recap, for the removal replant permit, there's the steps involved is the application, the review of that application either by by somebody like myself, and then the permit is either issued or in some cases denied. That's if it's a permit is issued, it could be over the counter by somebody like myself or a tree inspector that has done a site visit. Then once the permit's issued, theoretically the tree is going to be removed, and then the tree is required to be replanted. A removal replant permit expires in 365 days. The idea is that within that time frame, the removal happens and then the tree has to be planted. Since we all know that there are good times in years to plant and not so good time a year, that leaves a large period of time to replant. In the past, that replanting has been assumed to be happening and only randomly enforced. However, we do have a new team at Urban Forestry that is specifically looking at making sure that the conditions of a removal replant permit have been met. And before it's finalized. And the conditions that I'm referring to are the replanting conditions. So there will be more systematic inspections or following up on replanting requirements. Those requirements, the follow-up for the requirements could happen by a staff inspection after the 365 days have passed. And if there's any issues after that, then a letter will be addressed to the applicant and the property owner. In certain situations, you can now the property owner or the representative can self-certify that they have replanted the tree within the expiration date of the permit. There is a link on our website that people will use to self-certify by uploading basically a photo and their signed statement. Actually, I'm not sure if they have to make a signed statement, but I'm sure that information they're uploading is taken as a signature of a sort. Okay, so next slide. Of course, there's always questions and sometimes disagreements about decisions having to do with permits. So we do have an appeal process. It is a little bit complicated and drawn out, and there is a fee involved, $200 appeal fee, which if the decision's reversed, that will be refunded. There is a very tight time frame. It's 14 days within the notice of the permit denial. And there's several different types. I'm not gonna get into them all, but if you look at the form for the administrative review and appeal process, it has details. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my team. We call ourselves tree techs. We all have different background and different skill sets. None of us are arborists or tree inspectors, but we are very familiar with the code, and we're familiar with urban forestry and who we need to contact for what. So basically, these are the type of things that we do. And just to let you know how big our team is, right now there's 5 tree techs with a lead tree tech, and then of course we have a supervisor. So we process your applications to make sure they're complete. We assign them to inspectors as needed. When we are able, we issue over-the-counter permits. That's generally within 2 to 3 days, but you know, time frame depends on our workflow and other criteria. Generally speaking, the permits that we're able to issue over the counter are type A permits for private trees that are less than 20 inches or within 10 feet from a qualified building or structure. We also currently review development plans for street tree compliance that may be changing with some reorganization of the city, etc. And we spent a lot of time responding to voicemails and emails about a wide variety of urban forestry related topics. One thing to keep in mind when you contact trees@portlandoregon.gov, which is our team's mailbox, it could be me one day, it could be another colleague another day. We don't necessarily remember from day to day what you're referring to. So I'm going to ask you, when you respond to an email, that you tell us what your question is specifically. And if you have a case number or a permit number, to include that, and certainly an address helps. I guess the main message is don't assume that the same person is looking at your email that looked at it the day before, and just say something like, did you find out what the status was? Question mark. Because just to give you an idea, we get about 100 emails a day currently. All right, next slide. So these are a couple things we don't do. And I've already talked about how we don't issue permits for trees that are being described as dead. So this first one spells that out. We do not verify or consider tree information that may affect a tree permit application, i.e. if a tree is dead, dying, or dangerous. We do not identify nuisance species from photos, and we do not issue permits that require an inspection. I'm going to make one little note, because maybe somebody's going to say, well, you know, somebody issued me a permit for a tree of heaven the other day. Well, there are certain trees that we can identify if you give us a really good photo, and tree of heaven is one of them. It's just across the board, you don't know if the person that you're sending the photo to is how much arboricultural knowledge they have or not. So you can't assume that we're going to be able to identify nuisance species from photos. All right, next slide. All right, let's see here. Next slide, please. There we go. All right, there's a lot of situations that are very specific and tricky sometimes, and I would encourage you, if you're not finding the information you need on our website, to contact us about filling out any questions about filling out a removal replant permit or any kind of permit application, actually. Next slide. All right, so these are just a couple of points I'll touch on again. This, first of all, I want to point out that the graphic here is not up to date. So always make sure you're using the most recent version of a permit application. They are always, of course, posted online, and make sure that you go through and verify that the required fields are filled out, because incomplete applications can slow down the process. We encourage people to apply online at Development Hub. And however, permit applications can be mailed or dropped off in person or online. And I did mention our time frame, you know, is the turnaround time frame for processing a permit right now is about 2 to 3 days. However, any of you who have any longevity know that at one point it was much longer, and it really depends on, you know, storm events, staffing levels, and other factors. So we'll let you know in a generally with our voice message that you get when you call our line or our email signatures, what the turnaround times currently are. For tree inspections right now, the turnaround time is about 2 weeks. And that's really great, because that also was pretty much longer in the recent past. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so here's just a couple of notes that I haven't mentioned already. On one application, you can put up to 3 trees for $100. If you have more than 3 trees, there's a supplemental form. Each additional tree is $25. And you can combine street trees and private trees on the same application form. If you want to come in and talk to somebody in person, we do take in-person meetings on Tuesdays and half-day Thursday. You can make an appointment online at Portland .gov. And I'm just noticing too that that online address is outdated. That should say devhub.portland.gov. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we process a lot of applications every day, and we see some common things that slow down the processing. For example, if you're missing a signature, if you have not indicated the tree that you're replanting, if you've left off a site plan, or if you have not submitted any photos that substantiate what needs to happen. So please, if you have any questions about what's required, there is a description in the instructions for the application. Take a look at that or give us a call, or you will get a follow-up email that lets you know what's missing. And once again, this graphic is not showing our current application, so sorry about that. All right, next slide. So like I said, the tree inspectors can't make a decision if they don't have the information that could potentially inform them. So please put on the application form the information that they're going to need to make the most informed decision. Next slide. And this is a common request that somebody wants to leave the tree as a wildlife snag. Just note that on the application so it's documented, but also know that that is still considered a removal. Next slide. All right, so I keep talking about photos and documentation. This is what we're wanting to see, and the clearer they are, the more expedient we can get your application process. So when you're taking a photo of a diameter, you should show the tape measure going around the tree. And sometimes if the tree is not the same diameter, more or less, all the way going up, we want to see a photo that shows that it's 4.5 feet off the ground. If you're trying to show us that the tree is within 10 feet of the house, please show a tape measure like you're seeing here that shows the detail of the measurement, this like 77 in this photo, and the tree in relationship to the house and where that measuring tape is. All right, next slide, please. When you're measuring the diameter breast height, like I said, it needs to be 4.5 feet off the ground. And next slide. We want to be able to clearly read that on the tape when we look at the photo. If you don't have a diameter tape, that's fine. You can use a regular measuring tape, and then you can calculate the diameter breast height. That formula is the circumference, which is the distance around the tree, divided by pi, which is 3.14. Next slide. All right, sometimes you have an unusual situation where it's hard to take a measurement. These diagrams are on our website, and they're showing you how you measure a multi-stem tree or a split trunk tree. Sometimes, every tree is a little different. It's not exactly a science, but try to get the split trunk tree measured right under the split. If it's a multi-stem tree, the equation is spelled out here. You take the diameter of the largest trunk and you add it to half the sum of the diameters of the other trunks. So that those details are on your maybe in your handouts, but definitely on our website. All right, next slide, please. So as far as the requirement of having a site plan, it doesn't have to be complicated. If you're doing a site plan that is showing us existing trees for a planting waiver, it can be something like the one on the left. If you're showing us simple, I'm going to remove the tree here and replant it there, it can be as simple as something on the right. Next slide. All right, so we have our online portal. It's called Development Hub. That's what we want you to try to use for submitting your applications. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail because this is just spelling out what's on our website when you go to the Development Hub landing page. I'll just note that in order to use it, you're going to have to log on and create an account and then go through the steps. If you have any questions of the technical use of DevHub, on the landing page, there is a link to a tech assistance person, and that is not our tech team. We do not provide technical assistance with the online development hub. Next slide. All right, so I've referred previously to the conditions of the permit. One of those is, of course, replanting the tree as specified in the permit in the specified time frame. You also are required to have the permit on site, display the public posting page on site. And then, keep in mind that it does expire, so the work needs to be done within that expiration date. Okay, next slide. So if you want to follow up on the status of your permit application, once again, portlandmaps.com is a great tool. You can put in the address of the property and then go to the permit section, and it will have a whole history of the permit and the status. Next slide. And remember, of course, I'm sure you're all aware of 811 and notifying utilities before you dig, because it is the law. Next slide. So oftentimes trees are have issues around utility lines, and of course, you all know better than me that could be potentially dangerous and take special care, and you should contact your power company before working around the power lines to identify any potential issues or hazards. Next slide. So I'm gonna add a little bit of information here about Dutch elm disease. Of course, there's a lot of other tree diseases and pest issues that you might want to know about, and there's quite a bit of information on our website. But for right now, I'm just going to mention some of the considerations with Dutch elm disease. So as this slide states, Portland has about 3,000 elms, and we lose approximately 40 a year. So if you do have a situation where you're working with elms and you suspect that there's Dutch elm disease, we monitor these situations, and we have somebody who specifically manages that program. And we would like you to let us know so that we can make sure that the tree you're working on is known and monitored. There's also information, of course, on our website about the elm protection program. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that the couple ways of prevention listed here is deadwood pruning during the winter months. there is a moratorium on pruning during months that the beetles are active. So we're suggesting, I'm not suggesting, that's why we're spelling out pruning during winter months. That you can also be part of the prevention by inoculation of healthy trees with a fungicide by licensed chemical applicator. And of course, keep in mind that requires a permit. And then the fungicide and other treatments, they're not 100% effective, but if used properly, they may slow the spread. And lastly, this is an important piece of it. You need to dispose of the wood and clean your tools before and after working on elms. Next slide. So here's the information about the moratorium of pruning on elms. There should be no elm pruning between April 15th and October 15th. And there are some requirements when you do prune. First of all, there's a permit requirements for the tree. The branches must be chipped. And all wood and debris must be disposed of within 24 hours of cutting. And then the property owner must send a disposal receipt to the urban forestry, the property owner or you as a representative.
All right, I'm going to introduce Dan Gleason. He is a senior tree inspector. Dan, do you want to take over, and you can finish introducing yourself and your topic in part 2.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Hi, everybody. Dan Gleason here, been with the city going on 7 years right now, mostly focused on the development side of Title 11 and working with arborists in that capacity. So for part 2, be talking about trees and development, as well as some discussions about violations on both the development and non-development side, as well as a conversation about changes and impacts to the tree code. I do want to say that the development side's a little bit different in that arborists can really have many different roles. In some capacities, development that involve trees can go all the way through without any arborist involvement, where some projects are rely heavily on private arborists report development and oversight through the project to meet Title 11 requirements. So with that, part of the requirement of this presentation is kind of go through the code of what it says, but I also want to try and bring it back to some of the experiences I've seen and talk about ways in which arborists are involved in different parts of development, as well as recommendations I have for how I think that we could improve how trees are managed through the development side of Title 11. And so in urban forestry, we often talk about development and non-development, and they're very set categories. In fact, there are different chapters of the code and have different regulations for as far as how trees on both the public and private sides are regulated, what some of the thresholds are, as well as how and what the actual permits involving tree work look like. It can be sometimes a little bit confusing about which aspect of the tree code is being initiated as part of a project. One of the simplest ways to think about it is that when we speak about trees under development, they're typically trees that are in association with other permits within the city, most typically going through the Bureau of Development Services. So if your client or applicant is engaged and required to have additional permits, it's worth looking into if any of the tree impacts or regulations with that are through the development side. Development can look very small, for example, a new egress window in the side of a house, to a new development in the Southwest Hills for 100 new units. That said, both those fall into the same regulations, but the requirements and the process can be very different. One of the big reasons that we're talking about trees in development and why it's kind of looked at as a different lens is that before Title 11, tree preservation and tree regulation was given a much greater pass, with the idea where if development was taking place, the consideration for trees wasn't really pulled into one of the important aspects of the goals of development. I think as arborists, we know that that should not be the case, in that trees are a huge component of having successful new development within the city that creates a sustainable and resilient community for us to live in. So with that, the tree code was developed to try to incorporate the idea of the importance of trees into development plans a bit more. So as part of the development process, we're now really looking at how street trees might be impacted, as well as opportunities and requirements to plant new trees, looking at on-site tree preservation and planting to make requirements for canopy goals to be maintained or increased or evaluated through the process, as well as including trees and canopy into the design and goals of large projects, both on city property and on public in the public-private side, as well as understanding that within development, individual aspects of infrastructure, including trees, can't be evaluated and looked at independently. We need to look at systems entirely. And with that, we have to coordinate with other bureaus and look at some of the other code requirements through development, as well as some of the other project goals to design and regulate projects that can meet the needs for those projects, as well as look to not have significant impacts on the overall canopy of the city. One of the biggest questions we have from arborists is understanding if there is active development happening on projects that they might be looking at, or just in projects in their neighborhood. One of the best ways to go about this is getting familiar with Portland maps. If you do that, you can search the property address, and within that can look to see if there is active permits and active development permits. These should tell you what kind of work is being permitted at that site, and you can even access plans from that. I'll go into a little bit more detail later, but for the on-site tree aspects of things, urban forestry shares our responsibility and regulation of Title 11 with planning and zoning. And oftentimes planning and zoning would be the primary point of contact for initial questions about on-site trees. So I noted before, one of the big differences about trees in development is that the regulated impacts to trees are permitted through plans, site plans, and building plans, rather than standalone tree permits. Sometimes there is the requirement for both having tree plans through the building permit, as well as additional permits for additional impacts, which I'll go into later. So as an arborist who might be involved in even being hired to take care of some of the tree work that is regulated through development plans, or if you're consulting arborists who might be engaged to help create plans and tree preservation and protection plans that can help meet project goals, really understanding how to read and evaluate site plans is a key skill, and one that can take a little bit of practice. So one of the first things to look at in development is, when is a tree plan required? As I said, for most development permits, a tree plan is required when there's going to be any tree impacts or future tree responsibility requirements. So this can look to see if there's tree preservations required, meaning that there's trees on site that are required to have a protection plan. If there is requirements to show that there is that on-site canopy density is met. And the most common reason for if there's trees needed is when there's street tree planting and protection standards. So for most projects that incorporate that go through BDS, there is at least street tree planting requirements set for it. And then the larger projects that either hit a threshold or have ground disturbance, or when you're starting to see on-site protection and planting requirements. I'll just note too, if questions do pop up, I don't have the chat open in front of me, so I'm happy to answer those as they come up if Sam, you want to facilitate some of those questions.
Sure, there's one question that you might answer later on, which relates to how trees fail due to storm while under a development permit. And maybe you can address that question during your presentation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll answer it quickly now and then go back into it now, is that if the tree is under development, meaning that it has an active development permit that hasn't been finalized yet, which has multiple stages, that can be under review, meaning the plans are being reviewed, being inspected, meaning the plans have been issued and the project's taking place. If there are any changes to the trees that have come through the storm, those should be documented and captured of explaining why the change took place, and a plan revision will be needed to ensure that at time of final inspection, what is on the site is actually accurately captured on the most recent set of plans. And so going back to speaking to plans, this is what a very typical plan set might look like for a new multifamily development, where it speaks to all the aspects going on, including the tree plan, noting trees to be removed and planted. With more complex plans, you will see layers of plan sheets that might not capture all the information on one page. So getting familiar to learn how to read through plans and look at different aspects, such as where new utilities are going to go, is there grading that's taking place, and incorporating those into a solid tree plan is how you can work with your clients to ensure that what's being put down on paper is feasible and meets the tree goals through the end of the project. Oftentimes arborists can be tasked to help set create the tree plan aspect of site plans. And with that, it's important to have the applicant show the existing improvements, what's actually there on the site currently, and then what's going to change. Where's the ground disturbance going to be? Where are new utilities going in? As I said, what's changing the land where the trees are located, which might impact the trees. This can often be not just what the final product is, meaning, cool, we're building a new house, let's just show that new house, but what are all the stages that go into building that? That can be construction access, that can be stockpiling, locations. It can even potentially be pruning needs for the trees for either the new structure or the means to actually build those. So understanding and thinking through what it actually takes to fulfill the project allows you to make the best tree plan that you can, and one that can be fully implemented through all aspects of the process. As I mentioned before, in development situations, the site plans themselves work as the permit for the tree work. So this can be very simple for some projects. This fake site plan I made years ago kind of show. In this situation, this plan is indicating trees that should be removed, protected and preserved. So if you're tasked with helping set the tree protection fencing, this is kind of what you would look at to where the location should be. Can note the trees that are set for removal. This is actually what permits the removals to take place. And so ensuring you're looking at the right trees and following through on those is important. And then noting if there's any replanting requirements. So if you were given this site plan by an applicant saying, hi, I'm building this new ADU. Can you help me with this aspect of the project? This is what you would use to understand what your role would be, and to look at what is going to be allowed. That said, it's also important to ensure that plans are actually issued by the city prior to taking place, for the work taking place. This would be the difference between having a tree removal application in your hand versus an issued permit. The site plans themselves need to be issued and stamped by the city for the work to take place. We can often have more complex plans and ways where there needs to be more information about the trees specifically. This can come up when there is a higher need for detailed protection plans that is assessed through an arborist report. This is a narrative description that either that someone else has prepared that you need to follow, or you might be tasked to prepare it yourself, which doesn't just show, but tells about some of the requirements that will be issued on the plans. This also comes into play that if you're tasked to look at exemptions for tree preservation or looking at creating a tree inventory, if there are instances where there are trees that are exempt because they're on the nuisance species list, or if they're exempt due to condition being dead, dying, and dangerous, this is where a supplemental narrative is required to say that as an arborist or a landscape professional, these trees are these species or in these conditions, so therefore exempt from different requirements, which will change the overall requirements of the site plan. This is a good opportunity as well, where we just talked about in a storm situation where you might have a tree change its condition as the project goes on. It's in the plan revisions, a tree that might have been preserved that was significantly damaged in the storm. You would work with your applicants to show that to be removed, and then as part of the revision, provide that narrative explanation saying, hey, this tree was damaged under the storm. It is now exempt due to condition, and provide that evidence as part of the revision process. That said, this is really kind of what a final site plan can look like. One of the important aspects as well is noting property lines here and seeing what is a street tree versus a private tree, and understanding that there can be very different requirements and conditions, and even the permit itself that's taking place for what allows for work to happen in the right of way versus work that's happening on site. Ultimately, in the city, these should all be coming together to create one solid plan. But as an arborist, understanding where the regulations are and what aspect of the site plan is that you're looking at and are permitted to work on is important to protect yourself, as well as helping to provide guidance for your customers so they know the process to take. So I'm going to go into some detail about why it's important to preserve trees. This kind of circles back to the idea of trees in development are oftentimes looked at a lot differently on a large scale versus private trees, and I'll call it a static atmosphere. I think we've seen even politically lately with some of the needs for other aspects of city life, additional housing, influx of needs for businesses, as well as other political changes that happen within it. Trees often come up against a lot of different competition for the land itself. So it is constantly a battle and an important aspect for us as arborists to be having conversations about why tree preservation and development is significantly important, both on the local individual project scale and on the community, neighborhood, worldwide scale. There's a lot of great literature and research, which I'm sure many of you have seen and been out there, as far as just the straight benefits of trees, which are some of them are listed here. But having conversations of why they're really important on a project by project basis is something that I highly advocate that you do while working and talking with clients, as well as trying to incorporate into the general culture of development. From my experience, you can have the best of both worlds, or you can have your cake and eat it too. When there's really good plans out there and we have arborists who are doing their due diligence and working to incorporate trees through the whole process of planning, we can then end with some of the needs for additional housing, additional uses of land, and have it so that we're still also having the benefits of having trees on the landscape moving into the future. That said, there are code requirements for tree preservation for many situations in development. For sites that are over 5,000 square feet, where there is ground disturbance, and typically where you're not in some industrial or commercial zones, there are preservation requirements that 1/3 of the trees, 12 inches and larger, are preserved. Also shifted now that even in the situations, trees 20 inches and larger are also required. I think it's really important to note this language can be a little misleading. By required to be preserved means that they need to be documented on plans, and there are additional fees that must be paid to go beyond those preservation measures. Meaning that you can have a site that has a bunch of 20-inch trees in a typical lot that aren't exempt, and 1/3 of those, or sorry, if they're between 12 and 20, 1/3 of those would be required. If they're over 20, they'd all be required. But developers do have the ability to pay into the tree preservation and mitigation fund to go remove and beyond that. With that said, it really means that there's more of a carrot than a stick for working to change the culture and have conversations with developers about looking for means to preserve trees within the projects. So this gives a little bit of the costs associated with going beyond that 1/3 in areas where tree preservation is not exempt. You can have a subjective view on how you feel these costs capture the value of a tree. I'll say that if we're using standard appraisal, they're typically much lower than a tree is appraised for. That said, you will hear both sides of the coin of feeling like these costs can really impact a project or not. And of course, it depends specifically on the project, the owner, and the future use of it. In most cases, if you can preserve trees and you can work to create a good plan, you're going to have greater benefit and less cost. As arborists and as reviewers in the city of Portland, we prefer to see trees on the landscape be preserved correctly than have them removed and costs go into, or payments go into the mitigation fund. So trees that are required to be protected, this can be one of those trees that is required through the Title 11 preservation requirements. There's also certain Title 33 and land use requirements that initiate tree protection. And with this, there are set means and methods in which we require trees to be protected and shown to be protected on the plans. This is one of the biggest ways that I see arborists getting involved in a lot of development, and have seen people really step up, especially over the last few years, of understanding these requirements and understanding ways to develop plans that can be carried through the project effectively. So kudos to you who have been really learning and evolving your protection plans as it goes. And this is something that I also have seen it ramped up, where I imagine more arborists are going to be needed and requested for these protection plans as more and more sites are being developed where these come into play. So as you move into the Title 11 protection, we have two different means of protection that have two different names. The first one I'll talk about is the prescriptive path, meaning that this is one that's not supposed to need advanced tree knowledge. It's a kind of one size fits all. Hey, follow this formula and your trees should be preserved. And that's incorporating a root protection zone with a standard tree protection fence that is 1 foot away from the tree for each inch of the diameter of the tree. And then there is some allowed encroachments within that that are shown here. So that said, this is something that developers can oftentimes follow. Okay, well, we have a 12-inch tree. I just have to go 12 feet out on all sides and put a fence. Cool, easy enough. I can go in 25% on one side. That said, this involves being able to accurately measure a tree, which not all developers can do on their own, which is even in the prescriptive path why I encourage arborists to be involved for not just identifying species and condition, but accurately mapping out where this prescriptive path parameters should be. It's not, yeah, I guess I can say this. It's not surprising that when I see developers do this on their own, trees are estimated to be much smaller than they actually are, which can have implications later on in the inspection phase of these projects, and more importantly, can have negative consequences on the health of the trees through the project itself. The other means for protection is called the performance path. And this is one where a certified arborist is required to make a protection plan because the prescriptive path can't be followed. This can be in situations where new development is within the RPZ, utilities need to cross the RPZ, or just general access. They cannot do their development by completely blocking out the standard pre-protection zone under prescriptive path. So this is one of the primary ways that arborists get pulled into these projects, and can take a little bit of work and understanding to really make a good protection plan. And so in the future, I'd actually love to do a presentation just focused on this itself, get some feedback and experience from those of you who have been highly involved in it, and kind of create some more guidance for this. That said, one of the handouts you got today is a guideline for arborist reports. This really outlines what needs to be shown in the arborist report for it to be accepted and attached to the plans, and the plans to be approved by the city. Currently, this is evaluated by planning and zoning, and we're brought in as consultants if there are questions that come up through the report. For those who have not done a lot of arborist reports for development, I definitely read through this carefully. It's almost like a cheat sheet for some of the aspects that you should think about in report and as you're developing your report writing. For those who maybe have done many reports, I would still go back to it. Many I see after the fact are missing elements of this that do come into play later on as the work's getting actually constructed. So the more information and diligence that is done through these reports, even if there's sometimes some pushback from clients, one of the things that we've learned, and I communicate to developers a lot, is that engaging arborists in the design aspect of the project and incorporating arborist reports not into just explaining how what is going to be built will protect trees, but building in a manner that truly does protect trees has a much greater outcome for the project, the trees, in the timelines and bottom line of the project itself. Trying to retroactively make adjustments once plans have been approved can be extremely costly and have a lot of time impacts on projects themselves. And this is something that we communicate, and I definitely advocate for you to communicate this as well. One of the important aspects that oftentimes is overlooked in the arborist reports is explaining why the prescriptive path is not practicable, meaning why can't they just keep people and work out of the standard tree protection zone? In some regards, this might be because there is a 60-inch giant sequoia at the edge of a 5,000 square foot site, meaning that the majority of the site is within the RPZ, so that no work could take place within that, where work can successfully take place in that without damaging the tree following these other protection measures. So that's kind of where the description of the alternative construction techniques and materials really comes into play. Also, an understanding of the species and potential impacts to roots that are out there. One of the things which I also really advocate and am pushing for is basing arborist reports and knowledge based on what is actually on the site, what's going on with the tree and the roots themselves, rather than just hypothetically what might be happening. I encourage you to, when you can, actually build into contracts and protection the ability to do exploratory root excavation, look to see what is actually going on with the site to make a plan that will work once ground is broken and the roots are exposed. This can often mean that taking the extra time to really have conversations with your applicant about all stages of the development is really important, as well as ensuring that what you're looking at is the final plan set and not just a preliminary idea of what will be built. The most successful reports I've seen where arborist is involved in multiple phases of it, saying, hey, here's the idea if we want to build it. Here's actually what it's going to take. Here are some extra factors such as location of utilities, which we don't have control about where they can go. What can we do with this? Arborists also get pulled into development in situations which are less than ideal when there's already been impacts due to development that may have negatively impacted trees, to make an assessment if those trees are still viable for preservation. As I mentioned before, there are times where the prescriptive path is used incorrectly. And so upon inspection, we find that there's been significant ground disturbance very close to trees, and they may have impacted trees in a negative way. This is where using different techniques and best practices to understand what the impact, how the impacts may have impacted the viability for final preservation of the trees is really important. Looking at impacts as well as looking at remediation that can happen to help alleviate some of the impact. For example, if there's significant compaction that has taken place that shouldn't have, working to create a protection plan moving forward, which will allow those trees to be successful even after the impacts have taken place. As I noted too, trees and development can be tough where the real estate for the land is extremely valuable, not just meaning the value of the land itself, but all the aspects of what needs to happen within the ground in order to build a house or meet many development criteria. You know, oftentimes we need to have new utilities. There can be dry wells that need to go in. Foundations need to meet certain criteria. There are certain setbacks that need to take place. There are a lot of factors which limit just the ideal situation for how development can take place around trees. And with that, we really need to understand and talk to our clientele about different measures and techniques that can be used to meet these requirements while best preserving trees. This can be boring under tree roots. This can be doing exploratory root excavation. This can be looking at alternative foundation designs, looking at alternative ground covers to balance the need for an individual project to give us the best success when it's all said and done. If you're just getting into the world of trees and development, highly recommend looking for some trainings and reading some literature that's out there that focus on tree development that really highlight some of these techniques. I also really recommend, as an arborist community, having conversations about what has worked and what has not worked is something that we should be doing regularly, because we do learn a lot from site, from project to project, and that information can really lead to success for future similar projects. Also said that, similar to we've been having these conversations about retroactive, to protect yourself and also to ensure you're doing your due diligence, anytime you are doing evaluations or looking at techniques, capturing this through photos and documentations so that if there's any question about what impacted the tree or what you have allowed or not allowed under your protection plan is clearly documented with evidence, can really help you and support that you're doing your due diligence and following your ethics as an arborist. Cool. As I mentioned, this is kind of the standard prescriptive path, which is the idea of just fencing off the location around this. This can get you can get creative with following prescriptive path, where with the encroachments and allowed development and material and methods, you can have projects developed with just fencing off that really does protect the site. We get a lot of complaints about how burdensome having fencing all over, especially residential sites, can be. But the other side of that coin is that we have seen when those fencing is not put up, when there's been a pass or less than ideal fencing material has been incorrectly used, it can be disregarded. And I say this, that especially in larger projects, we hear the idea that tree protection is about communicating from the highest level all the way through every worker who enters the site, so that you don't end up in a situation where the person who is filling in for the excavator that day doesn't understand what the tree protection zone is and makes impacts that significantly damage a tree. Having the fences up there is one of the clearest signals, and having the fences can't be moved is basically our way of ensuring that these regulations are very straightforward and standard and can be followed all the way through. So I mentioned that we do follow through with tree preservation inspections. It's once the permit has been issued, before ground disturbance is supposed to occur, we as tree inspectors go out, look at what the plan was that is provided on the site plan. If you provide an arborist report, look at the arborist report and ensure that the trees are following that and plan is protected. We do have the ability to take an approved plan and deem that is not adequately protect the trees. It's not something that we like to do, but have done when arborist reports have clearly not done their due diligence. And it is pretty clear that what is prescribed there will have negative impacts on the trees, that we require additional information or protection plan to be deemed. This is pretty impactful for the project when this happens, and can basically look bad on the arborist, the developer, and get people mad at the city. So again, really try to highlight that doing your due diligence before permits are issued really sets the project up for success. We also get pulled in if there's any violations are reported. This can look to that tree sizes were not reported correctly, so trees that were deemed as not exempt truly shouldn't have been exempt, and preservation should have been required. Ground disturbance is taking place without tree protection going forward. Trees are being removed prior to the permits being issued, in any number of other deviations from the protection plan. Again, these can have pretty major impacts on the project, can really impact time and have costs, and more importantly, can result in trees which should have been and could have been protected being impacted in ways that will have impacts on their long-term viability. Another aspect of trees and development is looking at tree density standards. This is a condition where projects that hit a certain financial threshold are required to prove that their site is up to a certain tree canopy density, either by documenting existing canopy on site or showing they have a planting plan that brings the site up to density. You let me know if you've been really involved in this as arborist. I don't see a ton of arborists involved usually in tree planting plans, which I think is a shame, in that I think creating planting plans really is a huge aspect of ensuring that we have really important canopy moving forward, planting trees in the right place, and advocating for species planted in areas where they can truly thrive is a really important aspect that we can put forward there. This density table kind of speaks to what the overall canopy requirements are for sites. As you can see, for industrial, institutional, or commercial uses, as you'd expect, the canopy requirements are lower, expecting that the use of the land is different with less landscape area than typical 1 to 2 family residential or multi-dwelling residential family areas. That said, the percentages go from the potential canopy of trees. So this is all noted in the Portland Landscape Manual, where different trees are given the category of small, medium, large, meaning the potential canopy space and what that equates for within density. Another aspect I would love to see arborists get more involved with this plan is advocating for trees that looking at final canopy and not just the numbers associated with them on plans, because you can mix and match in many different ways. So for example, on a lot like this, you could have 7 small trees planted, 4 medium trees, or 2 large trees. That said, we all know that for different sites, these numbers are not going to be what's best for those sites or for the trees that are being planted there. So really looking at the conditions on the site, potential aerial canopy, and what's going to happen with the land in the future, and creating a planting plan that works. Working with your applicants for that way is really what's going to promote the best long-term canopy. With this, we also always try and give a plug for encouraging larger form trees to be planted, meaning that those 7 smaller trees are not going to have the future return investment as 2 large trees on a site if they're cared for and raised through maturity. So looking where we can get large form trees planted in a way that really aligns with what the development's being used for, is a way that we can really promote healthy canopy that won't have impacts later in life. So another aspect of what we look at both on the development and non-development side is what happens when the tree code is not followed. This can be removing trees without a permit, not following protection plan, in pruning beyond that doesn't follow industry standards, as well as a number of other aspects. If you're ever curious about what could be a code violation, I recommend really reading some of the small print on the tree permits that you get on the non-development side. It really goes into the detail of speaking to kind of what your permit actually allows you to do, and does talk to following industry standards for the work that you're doing. So again, here's a list of some of the common code violations that come in. Ones that I think all of these people as arborists can be involved in and helping to advocate against. The topping and excessive pruning is always an unfortunate one that comes up, and is one that I'm always pretty frustrated when I see people on the local tree care provider losing their spot because of that. Because successfully pruning is such a great thing that we can do for the urban canopy, that going beyond that is really impactful. As well as the failure to maintain trees during protection and development. This can really go 2 ways. Oftentimes, this is not the violation that's attached to the arborist who's doing it. It's attached to the contractor from developers. But it is an aspect that arborists, by having a good relationship, good communication practices, and a very good tree plan, can help avoid these violations during it. And with that can also, developing good relationships with contractors can also lead to more work and successful relationships, which will connect to other projects. Renee noted before, we actually have a new code compliance division of urban forestry that's just been created this year. This will be the primary factor that's looking at a lot of the non-development related code compliance and violation criteria, as well as looking at compliance for replanting when things are not associated with development. The violation process can be pretty different from development and non-development, in that the violations within development are attached and live with the development permit itself and can have consequences on the project itself, where non-development can have impacts to the contractors and property owners that can stick with the property until the violation's resolved. There are many different means to correct a violation. Oftentimes it's just alleviating what the violation was, if possible. Oftentimes there can be a long-term pruning plan. For ones that persist, especially hazard trees and code compliance, there can be a nuisance abatement process, which liens can be associated with properties as a means to getting the issue resolved. Here's the current fee schedule for violations. As you can see, there is fees associated with the process of going out, inspecting, doing the due diligence for us to go through the violations process itself, as well as impacts, civic fees for the damage that took place. Before I go into this slide, I realized a aspect which I didn't go into in detail, which is heritage trees and development. It's really important to note that heritage trees do hold the highest level of protection within the city, meaning that they are regulated through the development code, but they also have additional regulation under the heritage tree chapter specifically, which says that no pruning, removal, or injury can take place on a heritage tree without specific written authorization by the city forester, which means that the protection and requirements on heritage tree can go beyond what are required for typical trees under development, meaning that anytime a heritage tree will be potentially injured, impacted, this could be root pruning, canopy pruning on private property, or just encroachment and impacts into the root protection zone. This needs to have a protection plan that is approved by urban forestry specifically. So anytime that you may encounter a project that involves heritage tree, I recommended identifying that early and connecting with the urban forestry reviewer to ensure that everything that's needed is there. This doesn't happen a lot, but the ones that it does, we need a very, very high level of protection plans if there's going to be development or ground disturbance or canopy impacts anywhere near the heritage trees. As I mentioned, Title 11, when I first started saying this, wasn't that old. We're now, it has been around for quite a while, but there are constantly shifts in procedures and impacts of which how Title 11 is applied and implemented out into the world. I really recommend that you as arborists out there in the field, you're seeing a lot of the actual impacts from your perspective of what Title 11 is doing, and with that mean ways that the city could improve or change to better protect the canopy, and also work with both the public and private side to create changes which would be beneficial moving into the future. Just like Damon kind of asked that question earlier, highlighted, hey, this is the policy, here's potential negative implication of that, is there a possibility for change? Bringing that up and sending it over to urban forestry is highly encouraged and does have change. Right now, there's overhauls going on within city government that's going to impact development and how that is, the permits are managing that, as well as urban forestry is working on updating our urban forestry management plan. And so getting the feedback from stakeholders at this point is extremely important and beneficial, so that these codes being written in a manner which includes perspective from all sides.